Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing a top 10 list for the best states in Victoria 3. We have a bunch of numerical weightings in order to apply and come up with an overall score, a state score for every single state. And what we are going to be doing is we are going to be ranking every single country based on that state score. You can see some of the weightings above, which are going to be resources, but there are several others. What we will be doing is we are going to be first going through the top 10 list, then we will dive into a spreadsheet where we have all of our weightings and all the things we are considering, and also discuss some of the honorable mentions that didn't quite make the top 10 cut. Kicking off our list at number 10 with 602 state points, we have the state of Yorkshire, which is one of 3 states in Great Britain that has a really high amount of mineral resources, which is the primary source of the points here. We also have Lancashire and Midlands being the 2 other states that have a lot of resources, but Yorkshire in particular has the distinction of being the state that is required for the very powerful Bacla Von & Co. company, making it the more powerful state overall as a result of having access to this company. Some of the weaknesses of Yorkshire, or the primary weakness of Yorkshire, is that it has a low arable land count, which can make building tall in it difficult, and also you won't have access to any sort of arable land, but despite that you still have enormous mineral resources, making this a very strong state indeed. In 9th place, with 669 state points, we have California, which is the only state on this list which actually has a negative state construction efficiency modifier. We've multiplied all the resource values times a weighted modifier to account for state construction efficiency, because even though there's a ton of stuff in California, you will have this negative state construction efficiency modifier, which makes it more difficult to make use of. It is tied to on top of a logging industry throughput modifier, which is quite strong, though there is not very much logging available in California. And we also have the Central Valley State modifier, which will have both agriculture and plantations. Notably, agriculture does apply to subsistence farms, so this is quite strong even if you are building everything but agriculture and are using your arable land to attract pops to your country. The agricultural throughput will still be valuable because it will apply to the people working in the subsistence farms. As far as resources go, or mineral resources, at first blush it might look like there's not too much. We do have a good amount of sulfur, a solid amount of iron, which is very good in the early game. Fishing wharves, very strong for depeasanting, very strong for in terms of construction, giving job openings, as is logging camps. But what is not present here is the gold that appears here and the oil that appears here. I believe the number is 50 oil and also 12 gold, which is really powerful here in California. They are one of the few, or roughly half of the states on this list that has made the list on the back of them just having a ton of resources. And also we do have the very large unused or arable land count of 300, which is going to be quite strong in a bunch of different ways. And so that's California in number 9 at 669 rating points. In 8th place, with 706 state points, we have Perm, whose notable feature is having the most powerful, at least at game start, state modifiers of any state, having 20% logging industry throughput, and also the very powerful and very rare 20% iron mines building throughput. There's only some 5 or 6 states that have this modifier on it, and Perm is one, and it also has logging industry throughput on top of that. In terms of the resources available, it looks a rather modest or straightforward, having really solid amounts of coal, iron, and a very large amount of logging camps potential, which are very strong in the early game, but suffers from having a relatively low arable land count, which can make it difficult to get pops to come here. But the crown jewel is more or less going to be the fact that later on you will get 60 oil appearing here in Perm, which is the biggest amount of appearable oil in terms of states that managed to make the top 10 list, and this is going to really make Perm transition well into the late game, while simultaneously being absolutely insane in the early game as you get to pop off with logging and iron mines throughput. The main thing that is going to be the difficulty you have in the early game is going to be getting pops to come to Perm, because you don't have a lot of arable land and you don't start out with a lot of pops here. Next up, in 7th place with 720 state points, we have the state of Wallonia here, which will have 10% coal mines building throughput, which is a modifier that a lot of these top states have, but it will be a rainbow state, having a little bit of each mineral resource. There's an additional points granted for having at least 10 of a given mineral resource. This is because this is useful for building vertically integrated economies, where you will be playing around mappy by having everything in a singular state. Wallonia leans into this well. This is particularly powerful in the early game, and so Wallonia does get rewarded for having a little bit of each resource in terms of its valuation. Doesn't look very good on the agriculture, only having access to livestock and wheat farms and not a lot of arable lands. But the thing that pushes Wallonia over the edge is the presence of very strong companies in Wallonia. They have the quite usable Franco-Belge company, apologies for pronunciation, which is going to be one of the better railway companies. The ones that are paired with a resource tend to be a little bit better, but railway plus motor industries, definitely solid, giving 5% infrastructure on your prosperity bonus. It's definitely usable. You probably slot it in if you gain access to Wallonia, but the thing that's really powerful is going to be the tooling company. Now, tools are probably the best thing to have a company on, or one of the best things to have a company on. Depends which phase of the game you're in. Really early on, it's probably iron. After that, it's probably tools. If you think of it from the perspective of your total economy, and the amount of construction dedicated to buildings in your total economy, tools will be an enormous one. And so having a really good tooling company is good. And between Lil Pop and John Cockrell, these are the two best tooling companies. And so the presence of John Cockrell in Wallonia here will drive up its points quite a bit. It is going to be a tooling company with also access to steel and motor industries, and so with just this and a generic iron company, you will be really good to go in terms of companies, and you will be off and on your way. And it is a company that you can slot in very early. As you can see, you start out with it slot in as Belgium, and on its prosperity bonus, also very powerful on top of all this, is 10% railway building throughput. It is difficult to get throughput on railways, which makes throughput on railways more valuable than it is for other industries, and so John Cockrell is going to be really what brings Belgium or Wallonia onto this list ahead of other states that will have much more mineral resources, on top of Wallonia also having the rainbow state, a little bit of extra value by having a little bit of each resource instead of having 120 of one and 100 of another. Just a dabbling of each is very good for you in the early game. In 5th place with 728 points, and also having the most early game points, we have the state of Ural. Now, Ural will, much like Perm, the sister state, have this 20% iron mines building throughput, which again is really, really strong in the early game when you have less throughput from economies of scale. And then it will have a no-nonsense checklist of enormous resource piles here in lead, coal, and iron mines, just having enormous reserves of each of these. Lead mines, it's very near the highest lead mine count in the game, the highest being 90 on Illinois, and these enormous amounts on each of these means that you can kind of scale well into the late game. But the three best resources that are particularly strong in the early game are going to be logging, iron mines, and gold mines. These are going to really overperform during that phase of the game. There's an additional 6 discoverable gold mines, which is a new buff from kind of the last period in time in which they reworked these Russian states here. The presence of 8 gold really pushes Ural up and over some of its previous rankings where it did not make the top 10 list before. Its downside is kind of the classic European downside, which is not very good agriculture in arable land, and a little bit of difficulties at the start, despite it having really, really good early game access to resources. It doesn't have a lot of access to pops in the early game, and so this will be a bit of a struggle, and so it will likely under-realize its potential in a lot of cases due to population. We're ranking the states as they are, not on the basis of how many pops they have, and so this will be kind of the thing that holds Ural back in practice, but in theory, this is just an absolute monstrous early game state to have here in Russia. Next up, in 5th place with 734 state points. These last few have been very, very close on terms of how things shook out in the state points. We do have the great state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania having pretty nice modifiers on both coal mines throughput and also the hardwood output. It's important to note that this is an output bonus, not a throughput bonus, so it will not increase the inputs required for the logging camps here. And then behind that, we have a good amount of mineral resources here. Not quite as much as these Russian states. We have 120 coal, which is quite a lot, 57 iron mines, 23 logging camps, nothing to sneeze at, but we see here a big improvement in the arable land count of 175, I believe is the number in here. It's actually going to be a little bit higher than that, but it is quite a bit of arable land, and also the kind of slightly above the bottom of the barrel sink in the vineyards, although you probably, for the most part, keep your arable land unused in order to get positive modifiers towards migration here in order to be able to build Pennsylvania up big and tall, but it is not on the back of resources alone and the arable land that makes Pennsylvania so good, although it is quite solid. It is also the state which allows you to slot in Carnegie Steel Company. Now, this is not best in slot, and it does require a bit of a later tech in open hearth process, but any company that has steel, coal mines, and also iron is going to be spectacular, and this is one of the ones that also gives you railway building throughput, so it will scale quite well into the late game. Really kind of hoping to see shipyards become a more important building, if they ever rework the Navy, this type of thing, in which case Carnegie Steel would move up a few notches, but a very, very solid company attached to a very solid state is going to put Pennsylvania here into 5th place with 734 state points. Next up, we are going to still be in the USA and going to have 4th place with 755 state points. The former rank 1 state from our last tier list is going to be New York. Now, New York is going to be a bit of a weird state in terms of its presence on this rankings list, because overall, relative to all the other states, it is going to have probably the worst overall resources. Now, these are still very solid for a state in the game, but it is worst relative to the top 10. We are going to have a decent amount of iron mines, some logging camps, which are going to be subjected to a chestnut modifier for hardwood output, which is very nice, and also a decent number with 20, solid for depeasanting early on, and then a smattering of whaling station fishing wharves, also going to be solid in that regard. And then we have a solid amount of arable land with 120, which is going to be giving us access to wine as well. But this isn't what we write home about. This isn't anything spectacular. Certainly not worthy of the top 10. It is only off of a few things that it gets on to top 10. The first is the modifier that was very, very, very strong last time we did a rankings list, because it used to be the case that electricity was not local and you could ship it everywhere. And so you used to just spam a ton of electricity in New York and ship it all over the world. And so having one state with this modifier was incredibly powerful. Now it only applies locally, but it is still very solid for a state to build tall, because once everything starts requiring a lot of electricity in terms of its inputs, this is a very strong modifier. It is important to emphasize again, this is an output modifier, not a throughput modifier, so it will just increase the electricity on the back end and not increase the input goods required. Secondarily, we are going to have a little bit of a bump from New York Harbor, again helping the manufacturers out, but it's not going to be anywhere near as impactful as the presence of the electricity buff. But very, very strong in New York is going to be our first monument that we are covering, which gives you an enormous countrywide bonus. These tend to scale well or better into the late game. They are not always present at game start, and you can sometimes build them sooner rather than later. This is kind of in the early-ish game. You will gain access to steel frame buildings, which is required for this, but 25% migration attraction is a very strong modifier to give to your entire nation. It works really well on the United States specifically, but just peeling New York off of the USA in order to get this is a decent strategy, and paying a little bit of extra infamy for being able to do this and get this bonus to your entire nation is something you can consider in your games. But New York is really getting carried by the presence of both the Statue of Liberty and the electricity buff to bring it here into 4th place with 755 state points. In third place with 808 points, we are going to have the only state in the top 5 that has neither a monument or a company giving additional bonuses to its overall score. Instead, it is just off the back of having the absolute most raw resources in the game, and that is going to be the Chinese state of Shaanxi. Now, it is also the only state in the entire top 10 list which has this 5% market access price impact modifier, which can end up making all of your industries around 10% more profitable, depending on if you are building them locally integrated or you are needing to ship stuff here and there, which is going to be really powerful. But this is going to allow, since there's so much mineral resources here, it's going to allow those all to be more profitable, even if you're shipping them to the rest of your nation, because it will come closer to using market price rather than the depressed local price. On top of that, we have the 15% agricultural throughput and plantations modifier, which is particularly powerful in the abstract, but in the context of what's actually going on here in China, we have 3.5 million pops in the subsistence rice paddies. This is an enormous amount of pops in the subsistence rice paddies, and this throughput is being applied to all of the stuff there. So this is going to be quite strong, even kind of at base values. It's important to note this is a subsistence rice paddy, and it builds into wheat farms. Oop, we don't want to do that. It builds into wheat farms, which only employ 5k guys per level, so spamming wheat farms will cause unemployment, but that little tangent aside, we are going to take a look at the great resources of Shaanxi, which is going to be enormous coal mines, enormous iron mines, sulfur, missing the lead in terms of having a rainbow state and not having too much logging camps, but in exchange for that, we will get the eventual 30 oil appearing here in Shaanxi, on top of this already enormous amount of resources. As far as the agriculture goes, we do not have especially good plantations to utilize or to exploit, kind of missing out on cotton, dyes, silk, or even the very, very good opium, but we still do have a positive modifier, which is going to make our tea plantations and our vineyards a little bit better than average once we depeasant and make room for these little bit of extra space in the subsistence rice paddies to make building this agricultural stuff reasonable. But we are going to be able to drain out all those peasants very, very well by exploiting these enormous amounts of mineral resources here in Shaanxi. Also going to scale really, really well into the late game off the back of having a lot of mineral resources, though being a little bit weak or weaker on the logging camp count. At number 2, with 820 state points, we are not going to be leaving China, and we're going to be having what a lot of people probably expected to be the number 1, and to be fair, this could have been the number 1 had we chosen different weightings for stuff very, very easily, because it has very strong and obvious advantages. We are going to have the very powerful state of Beijing. Now, Beijing does not have the river modifier anymore, but it does get the coal mines throughput modifier that is present on a few of these states. It is going to have pretty solid resources, or middling to solid resources. Middling certainly for this list. This is not going to be where the power is at for Beijing, though. Where the power is going to be at, and it's not going to be in the agricultural sector as well. It's roughly equivalent on agriculture to Shaanxi, although over 300 arable land is solid. Also as solid is us gaining access to silks. This is all well and fine. Don't have access to the rice, and also are going to have the rice paddies. This is a bit annoying, but what we are going to have is the Forbidden City, which is a monument that is very powerful and is available from the start of the game. 20 legitimacy from including the head of state and government is very, very strong. We didn't really decide which monuments were better and by how much, so much in our calculus, and had we done that, it's possible we could have pushed Beijing up a little bit more, because this is probably the best monument, although it is a little bit hard to tell. It's the best monument in the early game. It's not going to be the best in the late game, but it is going to be very powerful nonetheless. And beyond having a very, very strong monument in Beijing, we also have access to a particularly strong company. It's not a best in slot company. It might be the best railway company. It's a little bit close. There's 3 or 4 that are kind of in the discussion. I think Kaiping Mining Company is at the bottom of that 3 or 4 discussion, but it is going to have a combination of railways and also coal mines, so it's going to pair very nicely with a tooling company. An iron company and Kaiping Mining Company is going to get you going tech spread is going to be pretty nice to have if you are playing China or you have negative modifiers, because it's mathematically more useful when you already have negative modifiers. This does require either Beijing or Hebei, but it is going to be satisfied with Beijing, and so this is going to be the number 2 state with 820 points. Big part of that coming from the Forbidden City here, on top of just otherwise being very solid, especially in the early game with both iron and coal that you won't necessarily exploit all the way, and having a lot of arable land. Finally, in first place with 892 state points, and also the only country in this top 10 list to have over 1,000 late game state points, we are going to have the state of Bombay, which has very similar advantages to the state of Beijing in terms of what's making it powerful. It's important to note that this is a split state, so when we're looking at some of the numbers of some of the stuff here, we're not taking into account all of the levels. We would have to fully integrate everything in order to achieve this, but what we are going to see is a little bit of a smattering of resources to get us started. These numbers are going to be a little bit higher, maybe 50 to 60% higher than as they appear here in terms of what we have overall in the state itself. And then we are going to have a very big arable land count. It's going to be 400 arable land with all of the state incorporated, and this arable land is getting to the point where you can build most things with the exception of opium, but the thing that is going to be the gate or the most powerful thing you can build is this is the only thing on the top 10 list which can build rice farms, which are disgustingly construction efficient. And if you have Bombay, you probably have a lot of pops, and so you don't care as much that they're not as pop efficient. But we're also going to have access to silk, dyes, and cotton all together, so we will be able to build nice and tall here in terms of the textile mills, and also have the available inputs coming in from each of these of silk, fabric, and dyes, which is going to scale well into the late game, especially if you can push level 50 in each of these, which you can because there's enough arable land. You could build level 50 in each of these. You could avoid building the rice farms if you wanted and still have the maximum amount of bonus from unused arable land for migration, while simultaneously being able to stack maximum throughput on the industries that feed into the clothing industries, which is a plate pattern that is not present. It's present for a lot of states in India, but it's not present for any of the other ones that the other states that made the top 10 list. But this is kind of dancing around the important thing, which is they also have a monument, a very strong monument in the terminus, Victoria Terminus in Bombay, which is going to give 20% railway building throughput, and this applies globally. So this is probably better in the late game than the Forbidden City or the Statue of Liberty, but you will get this monument a little bit later, and so it's a little bit tougher. It's also not as good when you have railway companies, as a throughput is more valuable the less of you have, and so this is notable, but this is a very, very powerful monument here in Bombay. And then also on top of that, much like Beijing, we have a very good company. This company is probably a best in slot company as far as rubber companies go, unless you have a unique company by playing Belgium or France or United Europe in order to be able to slot in the Belgium specific one, which also can tag iron, although that's less important now as they've changed companies. But we are going to have Bombay Burma Trading Corporation, which is going to be better than vanilla slightly in terms of the logging and rubber companies. So we didn't give it a full BIS score for the companies. It's receiving a modest but powerful score though, but rather than getting infrastructure, which is what the base company for logging / rubber gives, we're getting coffee and tea plantation throughput, which is going to be slightly better, and this really pushes Bombay over the edge. Now, if you wanted to discount some things, you wanted to say maybe this company is not so good, maybe it's not so important, that it's just slightly better than the regular logging rubber company, and also maybe you wanted to say that you wanted to discount the Terminus, Victoria Terminus in terms of its power because it comes online much later, you could have a sort of argument where this moves down to somewhere in the third or fourth discussion and the other countries move up, but it is going to be very solid in Bombay. And Bombay is also the country that you can acquire, or the state you can acquire, with spending the least amount of infamy out of any state on this list, I do believe. Maybe not California. sorry for a lack of a warning on showing the spreadsheet on screen. Your kids are scarred for life now. This will haunt their dreams forever. But we do have the math by which we came by our state score for each of these rankings and for creating this list, as well as a whole bunch of honorable mentions, although it is important to note these honorable mentions are not just, the 30 countries or so that failed to make the list, but they are countries that have a specific thing to observe or be interested in that failed to make the top 10 list. But let's get into some of the modifiers and the way we were thinking about things, and I think that this might be interesting to some people, and also if you think that I am wrong in one of these categories or how I'm thinking about the thing, then this will give you an opportunity to know how you should adjust this in terms of thinking about what the top 10 looks like for you. So coming into this, we have arable land counting for, or first of all, we have this early and late game. We have this bifurcation. We could even have this middle game, but we gave everything a weighting that is going to be variable depending on which phase the game you're in. And as you can see here, we have an early game and a late game. Our overall score is the average of the two of these. And so when we talked about Ural being the best in the early game, what this meant, of course, was that of the other countries that made the top 10 list, it of course was going to be one of the weaker in the late game. And we also do see the very strong late game Bombay. But a lot of things just are different value in terms of the phase of the game. And so it's really hard to rank them. And it's made a little bit easier by having this early and late game modifier. For arable land, we had it not so strong in the early game and considerably strong in the late game, especially after the peasant nerfs. Peasants really don't stimulate the economy very much, and that's generally what a high arable land count that you can't make use of is. But later on, you will actually start having to build more of the agrarian stuff because you can't import it as much, because the AI can't keep up with you, and because trading in general is weak. And so you being able to build your own agrarian stuff becomes more useful, and also agrarian stuff for the purposes of migration and these types of things becomes more useful. So we have arable land being twice as valuable as it was before. We also have our old, outdated kind of ranking list, where we thought arable land was worth 0.25. We also have our old rankings here, which was New York, Eastern Mali, which is completely off the list, and then you could see the very heavy value on the electricity bonus by having Ontario on this list as well, which they've no longer made it. But continuing on here, we have a river multiplier, which is going to be a multiplier that is taking into account negative infrastructure, negative state construction efficiency. The negative infrastructure is half of whatever the value we're applying here, and we're applying an additional 10% juice if there is a mappy river. So you can see Shaanxi is juiced up a little bit. The next one that would be juiced up a little bit that we took a look at is Kharkiv. But continuing on, this is multiplied by all the resources, because this will make everything in terms of the resources and the manufacturing you build around the state, it'll make it more powerful. This scales really, really well if you have an enormous amount of arable land. So the river modifier and arable land, in particular, having a really big arable land count. Where is Jiangxi here? Although Jiangxi does not have the most arable land, Jiangxi does have a river and 600 arable land. So in terms of building one place really tall and having manufacturing bonus, Jiangxi is probably the best state in the game, although it's not really reflected in its state score of 354, but the river multiplier is going to be useful. Gold is really hard to evaluate because you don't use any construction for the gold fields, but simultaneously not all of the gold is discovered at all phases of the game. The PMs on gold are absolutely insane just in general. In the spreadsheet, if you look at the spreadsheet for the PMs on gold, they don't account for the minting, and so on top of that, they're like 25 to 30% more powerful in terms of value production, but the value production that's juiced on top of that is just straight to the pocket, free money minting. And so gold is really, really strong through all phases of the game. Next up, we have oil, which when I asked for feedback, a lot of people thought that my oil score was too low. I had it at 6 previously. I bumped it up to 6.5. I do think that the oil is really powerful, and often you run a shortage of oil, but like you don't necessarily... It's a difficult one to evaluate because it's tied up in being able to use other PMs and this type of stuff. But I don't think that it should be closer to gold in terms of value, and then at a certain point the gold the gold PM is the same as the sulfur PM when you don't include the minting. And so at a certain point the problem is you're evaluating stuff in terms of opportunity cost, and the gold is just always going to be the best thing to build, always. And so, but in terms of, if we have 10 gold mines, would we rather have 10 gold mines filled or 50 gold mines or 50 sulfur mines filled? We'd much rather have 50 sulfur mines filled. And so one of the problems with rating all of these is there's a trade-off between opportunity cost, and then or thinking of things in terms of opportunity cost, in which case I always build the gold first, and then there's thinking about things in terms of realized potential, which is, if I have all of these potentials filled out, would I rather have X number of this or Y number of that? And so you see that in particular, relative to everything else, gold is much, much better in the early game, and we generally have a higher late game scores as resources. We have scoring higher in the late game. Having more and more resources is more important in the late game, and so I tried to get some of the values to work like this. In particular, we also have a very strong weighting for iron in the early game. This is one of the other really strong early game resources, where it is going to look a lot better than in the later game, mainly because when you are on iron frame building specifically, and to a lesser extent steel frame building, this is like the number one input, and it's just critically important thing. Also, in terms of the early game weighted resources, we have lumber. If you are in de-peasanting mode, all of the 200 construction cost buildings are really strong. We have all of these as having really high values. Getting people off of peasants is going to be really worthwhile, and so this is why we have the really heavy weight. Notably, they de-peasant faster than gold, but gold is still just opportunity cost-wise very, very useful to build. We also have, coming on up, lead, and it's important to note, lead, sulfur, and also coal we have getting more valuable in the kind of later phase of the game, but they're getting more powerful alongside a lot of stuff also decreasing in value, and so they really, really kind of more or less turn online with later PMs, and more stuff's required, especially coal. As you start using labor-saving PMs, coal becomes a resource that you use a lot more of, as well as when you turn on electricity for the coal-required electricity. There's also going to be phases in the game when the coal inputs decrease, but this is going to be one that I think scales quite a bit. But one of the problems is coal is a little bit different than the other mineral resources in that, generally speaking, you don't run out of coal very easily. It's much easier to run out of sulfur in single player and lead in multiplayer, and so I think that also the running out of the XYZ thing is maybe something our sample size is a little bit too small on, but availability also informs value. It's more valuable to get something if you can't really find a lot of it on the map, and coal is generally pretty abundant, and usually you don't have to go around digging for coal unless you're playing Ethiopia, in which case, you cry yourself to sleep at night because there's no coal in Ethiopia. But also in here, we have rubber is kind of the last one we didn't talk about. We have it as a score of 1, and we have it as a score of 1 because I think towards the tail end of the early game is when you get rubber tools. Rubber tools are insane, so we put some value in here, but it's not all going to be discovered, and you're not going to have it through most of the phase of the game. But then rubber is really, really important, and also rubber is a throttle. Eventually you can't turn PMs on because of rubber. Rubber really suffers from the scarcity. So does oil. This is like one of the reasons why it's high up there. Oil is not going to be, in terms of if you're comparing oil to coal, like, would you rather have 4 finished coal mines or a single finished oil field? It's probably 4 finished coal mines. It's just opportunity cost. Oil's going to be way better. Although, yeah, I mean, maybe oil should be a little higher. This is my thoughts in terms of what I might be getting wrong with these valuations on the resources are that gold should maybe be even higher still, and oil should maybe be a little bit higher. But I kind of didn't want to you get some warping effects, I think, in terms of valuing the states as well when you push oil really high. And so maybe I'm just running away from that. Like, if we made oil like 7.5, then Baku would be in the top 10, which I don't think it's top 10 country, but it has 240 oil, so it goes from being like nothing to being like really, really solid state, or I said country, not state. But that's what we have kind of in terms of the resources. We also have this section here, which is just yes, no type considerations, and a little bit of weighting towards different periods of the game, where we have, if you have over 10 of any of the mineral resources, you will trigger this. Which is to, the idea is this is to help encourage a vertical integration and the value of, you know, being a little bit more mappy oriented, especially in the early game. We maybe should change the weighting to be more early game oriented, but I thought it was really important to have access to some iron in the early game, especially as you're trying to get your construction on board. So we have the double weighting here, and then the single. I didn't want to push this value up too much. Maybe I was a little bit conservative with it, where we're getting, you know, roughly the equivalent of, like, if the coal is valued at, or if the iron's valued at an average of like 2.5 or 3, we're effectively getting an additional, in terms of the iron, an additional 5 or 6 iron worth of value by having the first 10 levels in terms of juicing stuff up. But I do think that this helped with the mappy stuff a little bit. It's one of the reasons Wallonia looks a little bit better than some of the other states, or than it would otherwise, is because of this. So we do have this. We also have, if you're on the coast, this is going to get a little bit more value. Specifically, we're thinking of the ability to build ports and also navy. We value this kind of lower in the early game because you're not kind of maxing out your ports or your navy, but towards the later kind of phases of the game, I think that this is something that's a little bit useful. Also, you can push infrastructure with ports a little bit if you want to. It's something that's kind of nice. Maybe this is too high a valuation kind of in the late game, and we're like overvaluing the presence of ports, but this is how we set it up. And then in terms of, if you're under 50 arable land, I think it's often very, very hard to get things going, and so we put in a penalty for that. In particular, if you're like below 20, it's also spectacularly bad, but there weren't too many states that were below 20, so we don't have a particular thing. 20 is the break point at which you are become eligible for mass migration. So if you have any place under 20, like the Trucial Coast or like Washington D.C., you functionally can't really populate stuff very well. But we didn't have enough states where we felt it necessary to put in a thing. But if there was going to be a thing, it'd be like minus 100 or something, some absurd amount. And here we have the thing that is maybe going to be the 4 categories that are maybe going to be a bit contentious in terms of how much value they should each have, and whether or not I kind of got the thing correct or this type of thing. For companies, we gave 180 points if a company was BIS, and in my mind, there's only maybe 3 to 5 companies that are like hitting this level of like best in slot where we would want to give 180 points, and then for S tier type companies, 120 points, and then for a solid company that you would slot in and be happy with, 60 points. Looking to mainly maybe have out of all the companies, 3 to 5 of the 180 point companies, maybe double that of the solid companies, and then double that of the companies that get you 60 points. In particular, you could see it's a little bit warping with the state of Wallonia, right, where we have Wallonia achieving 240 because it has both a BIS company and a solid one. We have also the BIS company on Asturias, which didn't make the top list, and also on Warzawa in terms of Lil Popco, which just came short of making the list. And then we see kind of a few solid companies that are worth slotting in, and a little bit of a note here, because I think the Bombay Burma Trading Co. Was on a relatively recent patch, so people might not immediately know which company Bombay has that would be warranting 120 points. We also have a manufacturing bonus. We gave 20 points for the shipyard bonus, 40 points for the better shipyard bonus, which of all the things on this list, only the home counties have. There's I think there's one with 10% throughput and then 15% throughput. Like, all the ones in Norway have the extra throughput and would get the 40 better shipyard bonus, and then 80 for electricity bonus. The electricity bonus is one that's kind of difficult because it's a lot better if you have a lot of arable land, and if you don't have a lot of arable land, it's not going to be that useful. But eventually building tall in a place with electricity bonus is something strong, and so we did want to capture that. The main two is Ontario and also New York in terms of ones that are in contention, kind of high up, that would get some points from here. And here's probably the one that is most contentious, which is monument score. We gave 240 for each of the really three good monuments. I didn't want to try and figure out which monument was best. This is maybe something we could have done, and we could have tried to rank the monuments. We could have tried to have them, be differentiated. But I thought that it would be... Before making this list up, I decided that I wanted the three monuments that are particularly powerful, the Terminus Est, the Forbidden City in Beijing, and also in New York, the Statue of Liberty. I thought that I didn't want to be fiddly with the numbers and be adjusting the values on the monuments just to get a particular outcome, or I was leery that I could just be fiddling with the monument's power level in order to have a first through fifth that I thought was appropriate, rather than using the system or the numerical values that we'd gotten to get here. So this is why I had all of these, or each of these monuments, at 240. The lesser monuments I had at 120, but they're kind of not important. They're in Washington, D.C. and Lazio in terms of the monuments that are good, that aren't spectacular. Notably, the monument that used to be in Eastern Mali and earned Eastern Mali its second place last time we did these rankings. You can see on the outdated rankings we have Eastern Mali at number 2. That monument just is useless now. It gives 10% education access, which admittedly I thought was an even stronger modifier than I do now, but it used to give it globally. Now it only gives it locally, and so it's kind of just a useless monument now. We do have this little bit for trade, which is kind of a fiddly type of thing, but I do think that it's worth thinking about. It is particularly strong in the early game, but very weak in the late game in terms of value. But if you get a trade adjacency that's worthwhile, you get some points for this. You get 10 points for a lot of the major powers or big trading partners. You get 20 points for any GP except for Great Britain. Great Britain being excluded because you generally just have a trade adjacency with Great Britain anyways, so giving points for this didn't make sense to me. And 30 points for getting a Qing adjacency, and this is only the case if it gives a new adjacency that was not previously had. So you see here with Beijing, we have 30 points for getting a trade adjacency with Qing, because if you just take Beijing off them, you'll have a trade adjacency. This will be nice, but we don't have this trade adjacency for Shaanxi, because you cannot attach Shaanxi to your market unless you are already connected to Qing, and so you're not really achieving the value here. In particular, there is a country that we wanted to take a look at, or the combination of, there's two states where this, I think it is makes a big difference in terms of how you're evaluating the states, and that's Amur, which had a state score of 452, which connects you to both Qing and Russia, and is just an amazing pickup for the level of infamy you have, because it starts out not incorporated on China. This is probably the most efficient thing you can take in the game, but also very efficient is going to be taking North Borneo for the adjacency to Qing as well. And this had a state score of 296. And then I think that the last thing to explain is this adjustment. This is an adjustment that is given for throughput. So anything that has a throughput bonus has some level of adjustment here, and it is applying we maybe gave a little bit too much to the hardwood output bonus, but we just applied the throughput bonus on top of the number of buildings they have, and then we have a weighting overall that is below 1 on average, where the weighting will be strong in the early game when you don't have a lot of levels and you won't have economies of scale, and then in the late game it drops off considerably. And this is a concession to the fact that you are going to have throughput from other sources, and throughput is not a 10% throughput bonus isn't 10% better in terms of the building, because if you're applying it to a 1.5 building, it's going to be considerably weaker. And that's why we had the values kind of here, which if we average them out, it'll be like, what is this, like 80% of the value, or roughly 80% of the value of this is what is getting tacked on average to come up with the scores. And this is the metrics we used. If you wanted to, I think we're going to link this in the description. It should be in the description, but should doesn't mean that it is. And if you wanted to fiddle with some of the values, I tried to make it so that you could just, change a value. Like, let's say you think I'm really wrong about coal, and you wanted to see what happens if you think coal is worth 4, and you can put that in and see what happens, and then you see Shaanxi would be the number 1 state. And this is something that, maybe we could do. So we tried to have it set up so that there would be the potential for that, and you'd be able to change the value of things if you want. You could also come in and like actually change the values of stuff. If you thought that 50 arable land didn't make sense and it should be like 80 arable land, something like this, you could do this as well, because the arable land as a general like thing, it's difficult because arable land synergizes with other stuff. And so often arable land acts as a force multiplier because it allows you to get more pops, and it also implies that you have more pops. And so there's maybe like better ways to represent this. Like Ural probably doesn't make the list because it only has, or like it probably shouldn't be this high because it only has like 400,000 pops. And getting Ural going in the way that it's scored, where it's really good in the early game, it's going to be hard to actually squeeze out this early game value from Ural, because you're not going to be able to build up in Ural 96 levels of iron in the early game, and so to some degree excess resources past a certain point, especially in the early game, is like less useful, but that's like a difficult thing to try and represent and make a system for looking at. But this is the system we came up with, and I hope for those of you who stayed behind to listen to this, that was a bit of an interesting one for you. Alright, so let's talk honorable mentions and companies that didn't quite make the cut. We had a very, very close was Warzawa, which has Lil Pop Co. It is a company which is tools, iron, and steel, I think, and it's probably actually the single best company if you could only have one company slot in, which is a very interesting one. They do have a solid amount of coal and iron, to head things off, as well as some lead, a little bit of arable land, but overall very strong. In the Poland HQ is Warzawa. We have Silesia, which is everyone's favorite German state. It was a former top 10 country. Silesia, it has a lot of the rainbow stuff going on. It has every mineral resource, which is very solid. It also has a very solid amount of these mineral resources and a respectable amount of arable land, but it suffered quite a bit from not having anything spectacular going for it in the department of stuff related to mappy / gaining a company, and so a little bit of a fall from grace. But 12 instead of a previous scoring of 10, it's fair enough. Silesia is still incredibly strong. We also have the new state of Baku, that is present in Central Asia, which is, well, I guess some of you might not know exactly where it is on the map, so we'll take a quick look. Baku is right here on the map. It has 240 oil that eventually appears there, and that's the thing to write home about, and that's kind of it. It also has 30 arable land, but Baku was kind of, when making this spreadsheet, was the thing that like made me like scratch my head the most or feel a little bit uncomfortable. It has the highest late game score, and it is completely polarized. Useless in the early game, tremendous in the late game, and that's of course because we have a score of 0 for oil in the early game and 6.5 in the late game. It's even possible that we should have like 0.5 in the early game, and you can see just how much this affects Baku, mainly because the reason why we don't have oil scoring high at all in the early game is because right when you unlock oil, there's not not too much demand for it, even if it is a relatively good PM, and you have to kind of build up demand for it. But the new chainsaws are much better than the old chainsaws, so maybe that's a reasonable shout. We have Texas, a former top 10 here. It was previously 8th place in our old sort of ranking system. Texas is going to be a solid one. They have a ton of arable land. They have cotton present, which is why we have a slightly better arable land score. I guess we didn't talk about this too much. We have, this is our rankings for why we do stuff. If it's livestock only, it's 0.85. Any grain is 0.95. Tea, wine, coffee gives you 1. Dyes, silk, etc. gives you 1.05. Rice gives you 1.1. Opium gives you 1.15. And whichever is your highest scoring resource, that's what the modifier you get. And then if you have throughput, a throughput modifier, it gets applied on top of that individual resource, wherever its ranking is, and if that replaces your top thing, then that's your new top thing. Okay, but kind of coming down, we also have Kharkiv, which has the new Russia Limited company, which is one of those iron, coal, steel companies, which is quite solid, on top of having very respectable resources. Iron's only 28, but we do have coal of 60, lumber of 20, and also Kharkiv is going to be the next state in the kind of top scrum that does have the river multiplier bonus. It has a Mappy river, and so you will have plus 5% Mappy, which is quite strong. So this would scale very nicely into manufacturing if you build a resource base for yourself. Kharkiv is located in Ukraine, but it is not called Kharkiv at the game start. This is kind of, I guess, one for, because with the change to localization of names, names are now according to which country they are in, and so I believe Kharkiv is Kursk, or it's Kharkov. This is Kharkiv. This is just the Russian localization of Kharkiv in Kharkov, but this is going to be the state that has the new Russia Limited company, which is going to incidentally be a little bit later, or a little bit good later on. I think it's slightly better than the American company, where we are going to have from this new Russia Limited company iron, coal, steel, and then also for the prosperity bonus, we are going to have a throughput on railways, and then also approval, if we can find the company, approval for industrialists. So this is the company here in New Russia Limited. Coming back into the browser, let's take a look. We have West Bengal, has the most arable land, and this arable land is particularly valuable because they have a 25% throughput bonus and also opium. So for every arable land they have, it is worth 125% of arable land, and so this really kind of carries them to some extent, although they do have a nice little 80 ball on the coal and 29 logging, so going to be very good at depeasanting, which is going to be useful if you are stuck with rice farms, and Bengal is stuck on rice farms. And so when you build an opium plantation, the rice farm fires 10,000 pops, because you need to make space for the opium plantation, and then the opium plantation only employs 5,000, so you cause a lot of unemployment. So the presence of this stuff is pretty nice to pick up the slack. We have Lancashire, which was kind of a runner-up in our previous outdated list. Lancashire, I think, was, yeah, they would have been 13 in our previous iteration. This is the Great Britain's state with the most resource, or the highest resource score, but it of course gets edged out by Yorkshire now because Yorkshire has the company. We have Asturias, which has one of the best companies in terms of the modifiers here. We have, if we scroll over, you can see we have the 180 applied to Asturias. This is located in Spain, España, where this is the steel, coal, iron company. The prosperity bonus is not the best one. I forget exactly what it is. It's not worth writing home about as much, but it can be slot in from the beginning of the game, and so this is why this earns the BIS distinction. It also has a very solid amount of coal, but not too much iron, but enough to get you started, you know, kind of enough to build some construction centers, do some stuff. We have Hokkaido, which is the most rainbow state. It is in northern Japan, and we see that this one has a little bit of everything in terms of the resources. I was interesting to see it score so high with our new metric. I was not expecting Hokkaido to get anywhere near this big, but you could see it does have a very solid amount of resources as well. We didn't double check the resources though. Maybe we should have. I thought that the values were the same because I don't think Hokkaido's been adjusted or is not on the slate of one that's been adjusted, but I do think they changed the arable land slightly in Hokkaido, so we maybe these values are not 100% correct. In either case, it wouldn't have made the top 10. We have Minas Gerais, which is going to be the best state in South America, I think. In particular, what you're looking at here, it is in Brazil, it is slightly inland, but you are going to be looking at the 10 gold being the main thing you're writing home about, but also having a solid amount of iron and lead. Although, kind of also kind of, here, let's take a look at Minas Gerais real quick, because we wanted to talk about it. We're going to have Minas Gerais right here. You're going to have a solid amount of gold. Also has the rubber. It was one of the few things on here with rubber. Rubber being really valuable, but a lot of the states with rubber aren't that good. But also an interesting one is Para. And maybe if we took a closer look at Para, maybe Para would be better. It really would suffer from the state construction efficiency, but we would have to take into account that you can get rid of this modifier, or you can downgrade it quite a bit. But this is one of the few other states that has the iron mines building throughput. I think one of the other connected states might have it. No, it's just Para with the iron mine throughput, and also Constantine has the iron mine throughput. Really, that definitely carried both Ural and Perm in terms of our scoring, especially in the early game. We have East Galicia, just overall solid state, has a very large amount of oil and coal. It is one of the bigger oil kind of counts. We have Samara, which is in Russia. This is a state that has a very large amount of oil in 90. Notably, there's a bunch of Russian states that did not make this list, even in the honorable mentions, that would be scoring quite high, having iron, coal, and enormous logging potential, which is kind of what we have in Tula, which is the honorable mention for most logging. Almost all their score is from the fact that they have 72 logging camps, and that's going to be really good. Amur, we talked about, is going to be located. It is not called Amur at game start, so let's take a look at it. But it is the western localization for North Heilongjiang, which is going to be the state that has the absolute most gold in the game, and it has a decent amount of resources on top of that, but it has a whopping 18 gold, which is going to be very, very, very strong for them. It also gives you adjacencies with both Russia and China in terms of being able to trade, although Russia will get claims on it, so get it at your own risk. Transvaal, we have the classic, South America strat to go for it. Notably, this also got a negative modifier for river multi that we gave, and this is because it has malaria, but if you took this away, it would get bumped up a few slots at least. Definitely very solid, definitely a very good place to go for. We have the wreckage of the former list with Ontario, former top 10, and the second worst fall from grace because the presence of the electricity bonus are not anywhere near as useful. We have Bihar, which is going to be adjoining East Bengal here, as states that are just very, very solid India states that have enormous potential in terms of the arable land, and they just outperform every other kind of, or the India states in particular just have the best arable land overall, or there's several India states that have insane arable land. You see here, we have the opium potential, we have the rice potential. This is the main thing, but also dyes and cotton, notably not silk, so we don't get the trifecta in terms of feeding in. But what we have here in Bihar is a combination of plantation throughput, which is really strong, and MAPI. So this is one that's significant about Bihar. West Bengal and East Bengal get a 25% bonus, and also they get a natural harbors bonus for the shipyards. They get a 25% bonus, but no river MAPI bonus. So a bigger bonus for them. They are also going to look insane. Also on this list is going to be Punjab, which used to have a lot more arable land, and now they have a lot less, but they have the distinction of having an enormous amount of farms, and also subsistence farms instead of subsistence rice farms, which is what's present in a lot of India here. And this difference, this distinction is going to mean that whenever you, kind of build a building like a dye plantation or a silk plantation, you only fire 5k pops. And so this is going to be useful for you because you won't cause massive unemployment. Also, incidentally, I think we already passed by West Bengal, but West Bengal has the most arable land with 601, which is exactly one more than Jiangxi, which I thought was kind of an interesting novelty. But coming back into here, we're going to have New South Wales, best state in Australia, and I'm expecting the Australian states at some point to get reworked. They have an unacceptably low amount of arable land that really holds them back, and if we take a look, they have the same amount of, I think the total arable land is less than California, which is insane. I understand that there's not a lot of arable land in Australia, but that just seems absurdly low, given the landmass size. But we can see 40 arable land here, but nice spattering of resource, 80 coal. The big thing is, of course, the gold. They do have negative infrastructure modifiers, but if we took a look at what would happen if they had 400 arable land, not saying that this is a reasonable number, but they come up quite a little bit here. We have East Bengal, which we already talked about. Sichuan, which is going to be a high-pop Chinese state. This is one of the better ones. It has a river bonus. It has access to building opium, and it has some resource in the coal and the sulfur. It is going to be one of the better ones. Although, at a certain point, when you're taking Chinese states, the real reason you're taking them is for the most population possible, which is Jiangxi. Jiangxi has a little bit of coal, but it has the most population in the entire game. Let's take a quick look at what it is at game start, which is going to be 24.2 million. So often the play pattern of Fujian into Jiangxi makes sense, and Fujian also is one of the few Chinese states that can build dyes. Both notably can build rice, which is going to be particularly good, and Jiangxi is going to be on the Yangtze River. You could, if you wanted to only get rivers, you could take a couple more states, but Fujian is going to lead in better. You could also just subjugate and release the country here, which I think is Yue, in eastern Guangdong, which incidentally, if you release the country with eastern Guangdong, it will break Great Britain's treaty port. So that's a play pattern that tends to be reasonably good. Or, well, depends on if at a certain point you can go high infamy, then that's kind of the way, right? But, and fiddling over denying a treaty port is less important. We have Rhone, which is one of the best states. I think this is the best state in France, which is the European states suffer from lack of arable land in terms of what they got going on, but Rhone does have a lot of coal, solid amount of iron, decent amount of lead as well. It is going to be quite good. We'd have to take a look at Alsace-Lorraine, which has a river bonus, and maybe Alsace-Lorraine could edge out Rhone, but we don't have it on here. Illinois has the most amount of lead, and it is an honorable mention in North America. It has 90 lead, which is worth kind of writing home about. And if you think lead is just way more valuable than I think, and also in the context of multiplayer, lead is way more valuable, Illinois gets a lot better. We already talked about Jiangxi. North Borneo is an interesting one, having strong MAPI or overall, a bunch of different things, but having negative modifiers for state construction efficiency, but they are also rewarded with plus 40 points because they get a trade adjacency both with China and also with the Netherlands, because they are connected to the Netherlands market, which is worth noting. One of the best expansion spots in the game. Trucial Coast, specifically Bahrain, is going to be worth taking, although it is a split state. It's split between 3 different countries, so you won't get all of this 80 oil, but it is a solid place to go after for oil. Lazio is honorable mention for monument, and so is Washington, D.C., so we'll just kind of come inside and take a quick look at them here. Lazio is going to be in the Papal States and will require, you have to be Catholic to get the bonus, but it will give you authority and influence, which is particularly powerful, especially if you're not on Sovereign Empire and you don't really have that great a source of authority. That is going to be useful. And then in the USA, this is it functionally should be worth nothing, but in the abstract it's kind of nice. You have local government administration building throughput, which means that if you were to run out of bureaucracy specifically and you don't care about trade efficiency, you would just build more and more in the whatever state has the White House, except the problem is that this state's not really a state. It has one arable land. So this functionally, in terms of effect, the White House it's effectively useless, but in theory it would be worth something if it were in a decent state. They should really merge Maryland and DC. Incidentally, this would cut down on the number of states. There's currently 660 states in game, or that was the number when I looked it up. We have Picardy, solid state in France, but not that solid overall. 243 points. We took a look at that. Punjab used to be way better. They used to have considerably more arable land, and they used to be the absolute best in terms of the arable land. I think we didn't emphasize the fact that they do get a river bonus too, on top of having the wheat farms and being able to build, I think, everything but opium. In terms of they can build the trio of cotton, dyes, and silk. And so it is the best state in the game for building tall, specifically for textiles. Because you don't cause massive amount of unemployment, and I think you don't have access to opium, but I think you do have 20 or 25% throughput on your plantations, and you have a river bonus. So let's take a quick look and just kind of confirm this. You have 20% plantations throughput, so 5% less than East and West Bengal, but what you have that East and West Bengal don't have is this 5% market access price impact, and you do have, the potential for silk, dyes, cotton, but no opium. So definitely one that plays really, really well for specifically building textiles tall, and I thought worth mentioning. We have the home counties, which is included in here just because it's Great Britain, but honestly, we didn't include a monument bonus, and it probably should have the 120 monument bonus that we have here, because it does get Big Ben, which gives 1% throughput on everything, which is really difficult to evaluate. But if we put that in here, it would score up to here, which is, fine, fair enough. We have Dalmatia, the OG extra honorable mention for having electricity. Now isn't that powerful anymore. I don't even think we successfully put it in, that it has the electricity, which would be an additional 80 on manufacturing, which if we put it in, it still doesn't move up at any place. And then we have the absolute wreckage of the previous list, perhaps what used to be the strongest state. We had it in the second place behind New York, but Eastern Mali, which used to have the Mosque of Djenne, which, let's just take a quick look at it for the sake of being a little bit complete here, and a little bit, nostalgic, which the Mosque of Djenne, shout out, used to be the best monument in the game, giving 20% education access, but this used to apply globally. Now it only applies locally. So a bit unfortunate on that front. But this has been our top 10 list, as well as a way of looking at ranking states. Now, let's just kind of, as a bit of an outro, quickly go through the top 10 as they were, and just very, very quickly highlight what was best about each of them. In 10th place, we have Yorkshire, which in particular is in Great Britain, has a good amount of resources in coal, iron, and also in coal, iron, and the lead, but importantly has a very, very strong company attached, Bachland, Vaughan and Co. We have California. California has a ton of gold and iron, or gold and oil discoverable, also has a very solid amount of arable land and decent resources, but suffers from a negative state construction efficiency. We have in 8th place Perm, which is one of the creme de la creme, just pure resources, especially in the early game, really benefiting from having iron bonus and a lumber bonus and a decent amount of both on top of coal. Really good in the early game, but Perm specifically transitions well into the later game as well, by having 60 oils. We have Wallonia, which is the prototypical, or one of the prototypical rainbow states. We have every resource here in Wallonia, but the thing that's really carries Wallonia is the presence of two companies that are particularly strong, including probably the best in slot tooling company. Next up is Ural. Ural is very similar to Perm. It's just pure resources. They have lumber and iron with a bonus on top of each, which will scale quite well, but Ural will be better in the early game relative to Perm with the presence of gold, whereas Perm gets oil in the late game. But still, Ural is going to be scoring a little bit ahead because this is an enormous amount of mineral resources here. Next up is Pennsylvania. solid amount of resources, but also gets a very strong company, and also has, kind of relative to some of these other cats, decent arable land with 180. Next up is New York, which benefits from having a manufacturing bonus in terms of the electricity, and also the first in the top 10 that has a monument. This really kind of carries it. It has a little bit of iron and some arable land, and lumber with a lumber bonus, but it's mainly off the back of the manufacturing and the monument. Next up is Shaanxi. Shaanxi is the purest of the pure resources, that is. Just has the absolute most resources and a river bonus, which really catapults it up quite strongly. Doesn't have a manufacturing bonus, doesn't have a company, doesn't care. Next up is Beijing, which has both a manufacturing, it doesn't have a manufacturing bonus. It has both a company and a monument. In the monument is the Forbidden City. The company is the Kaiping Mining Company, which is both coal and railroads, which gives its prosperity bonus in terms of additional tech spread, but it is also going to have a decent smattering of resources, which is going to be good early on, and quite a bit of arable land on Beijing as well. Also on Shaanxi. Shaanxi incidentally also has bonuses to arable land, so it scores a little bit better than most. And then finally we have Bombay. Large amount of arable land, but Bombay, much like Beijing, has a combination of both a company and a monument. The monument is the Victoria Terminus, which gives 20% railroad throughput globally, and the company is slightly better than generic rubber and tool or rubber and wood company that requires you to take a little bit of territory in Burma as well, but once you get that online, you will be rewarded with 10% throughput on, I think it was coffee and tea, which not the best industries, but is slightly bit better than the additional infrastructure from population. Also have a smattering of iron and lumber here, and a little bit of gold, which is nice, and also Bombay have a decent kind of things to build in terms of the agrarian stuff, in terms of having rice. I think they have everything but opium that's important. But that was kind of our tier list here. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let's take a quick look at the victor of Bombay in terms of the tier list. And let's take a quick look at the victor. And this will wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Do the YouTube algorithm thing. And other than that, have a good one. Bye-bye now.